So welcome to our virtual OECD Berlin Center room. We're having a very important event today with together with the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies and what is to be more broadly our CEE network. So the war in Ukraine, as you know, is for and foremost a human tragedy for people concerned in Ukraine, but it also has, of course, enormous economic and social repercussions on the global economy, but first and foremost on the region. And so I'm very happy that we were able to put together a panel of experts on the region. And Richard Grieveson of the Vienna Institute will introduce us into the subjects, the different economic repercussions based on a study they just put out and had a very interesting article in FAZ on this already. And then we have a panel of experts from different countries and parts of society, but all engaged in the region. My colleague Nicola who heads the Polish desk at the OECD is here. Welcome. Barbara Zollmann is the head of the German-Hungarian Chamber of Commerce and can tell us also about the repercussions on trade and investment in the region. Milan of the German Council on Foreign Relations here in Berlin is, I think, a Slovak national and an expert on Europe, European policies with a particular focus on the region. And we are also very happy to have Piotr Arak of the Polish Economic Institute, who can tell us about how the situation looks from Warsaw, from Poland. So without further ado, Richard, I'll give you the word, and we are very curious to see what your assessment is of this situation.
Thank you, Nicola. Okay, I start by sharing my screen. I hope everybody can see that. And I'll make it full. First of all, thank you for the invite. Despite the very sad circumstances that we're discussing, I'm happy to be here and to be able to present some research that we've been doing at our institute on this topic. So my task is to talk about what the Russian invasion of Ukraine means in a humanitarian sense, economic and financial sense for those countries and for the rest of Central and Eastern Europe. I will present mostly a paper that we published this week, as Nicola said, and then also some inputs from other research, other work that we're doing as well. Of course, it's evolving all the time. Research is very quickly out of date at the moment, so I'll try to give the most up-to-date assessment that I can. I should talk for 15 to 20 minutes, certainly not longer than that. And I will do 6 things, basically 6 topics. I will start, as we think we should always start, with the humanitarian impact of this, then inflation, GDP, which is probably the most important part for the rest of Central and Eastern Europe, financial contagion and the policy is around that, then trade, then the labor market implications, and then finally some first thoughts on the medium-term structural changes that this could bring about. So starting with the humanitarian impact, we see that so far about 20 million people have been directly affected by this. About half of the population of Ukraine before the war lived in the regions that have been directly affected by the conflict. That could go higher. We think it could go up to about 29 million, so about 3/4 of the Ukrainian population, but it's already half the population. It's already a very severe humanitarian impact that we are talking about. This has caused human suffering on a pretty horrific scale, and there are 2 ways that is happening. Firstly, people internally displaced within Ukraine, and secondly, refugees who are leaving the country. These assessments here are from the 3rd week of March, so the situation has already evolved a bit beyond this, but it gives us an idea of the scale of what we're talking about. So you see on the chart on the left at that point, so in the 3rd week of March, we had 6.5 million people internally displaced, 3.4 million refugees. These numbers can go higher if we think about different scenarios, and a colleague of mine who specializes in conflict economics ran through these numbers. We could be talking about refugee inflows, so people leaving Ukraine and mostly, as we know, coming into Central and Eastern Europe, 3 times the size of the 2015-16 refugee and migration crisis in the EU. Most people, as I said, are going, at least initially, into Central and Eastern Europe. Piotr will be able to say much more about this than me, but we know, of course, especially in Poland. So even at this point, we had more than 2 million people arriving from Ukraine into Poland. The economic costs of this for Ukraine are dramatic, obviously. There's a lot of information in this table. I wanted just to highlight the line that with an orange bar around it towards the bottom. This gives a scale of the measurable impact so far on Ukraine. So as I said, almost 20 million people have been directly affected. The regions directly affected by the conflict are more than half of Ukraine's GDP, 43% of industrial production, half of goods exports, 3/4 of services exports, 1/3 of agricultural production, and a great deal more of the agricultural production cannot be exported because of the conflict in the south of Ukraine, and 2/3 of the FDI stock. So it is an enormous economic impact. It has drastic social implications. We're doing our forecast updates at the moment. We think we're looking at a decline in GDP this year of probably at least 1/3, but of course, huge uncertainty around that. For Russia, it's also an economic disaster, a self-inflicted one in Russia's case. We again did some scenarios, some modeling around this. I think Russian GDP will fall by at least 7 or 8% this year. Inflation will hit 30% by the end of the year. Of course, also a lot of uncertainty around these projections. The decline in Russian economy could certainly be more than 7 or 8% this year. We looked also at the past as a guide, so what's happened in the Russian economy since the end of communism. So the biggest decline that it's faced was about 15% in 1992. We're not in that scenario. I mean, the transition recessions for Russia were more dramatic than what we're seeing now, but we think a decline in GDP of, as I said, at least 7 or 8%, but could be 10, could be even a bit more than that this year, is also quite feasible for Russia. What it means for the rest of Central and Eastern Europe. I mean, there are numerous channels of contagion. There are numerous ways that this conflict will affect the economies of the rest of Central and Eastern Europe. The most important, certainly at the moment, is the inflation impact. So we're seeing massive inflation in the region, the kind of inflation we haven't seen for at least a decade, in some cases longer than that. There are countries, as the chart shows here, so the Baltic states, for example, where headline consumer price inflation is well into double digits already. That's, of course, having a big impact on real incomes, and that will harm growth. So we think even probably best case scenario, we're talking about 1 to 2 percentage point reduction in growth across Central and Eastern Europe this year, and in some countries probably more than that. So a 1 or 2 percentage point decline versus what we previously expected. Within this inflation story, of course, energy is the big story. Everybody's talking about energy, and rightly so, but I want to also highlight here food prices. So this is another area of massive inflation in the region. There are countries, so if you look at Latvia here on the chart, the gray line, for flours and other cereals, we know that's a big part of what Ukraine and Russia export to the global market. We already have inflation of over 40%. So we're talking about already, and this could get much worse, but already a really difficult social situation, a difficult situation, especially for poorer households in Central and Eastern Europe. And it's no surprise that we're seeing price controls or more and more discussion of government intervention in markets, considering the scale of what especially poorer households are facing with energy, but also food prices. Another important channel by which the rest of Central and Eastern Europe is being affected is the financial channel. And we saw, especially at the start of the invasion, big weakness in the region's currencies. Now, a lot of them have come back, especially so Czechia, for example, the koruna is more or less back to where it was before the invasion. And we haven't seen the scale of weakness that we saw in Russia or in Turkey or Ukraine, but still, we've seen a lot of weakness in the region's currencies. We think that stability risks from this are limited because governments have a lot of space actually to act. We see that foreign reserve levels are pretty high in the region. That's the chart on the right. And we've seen a lot of intervention in currency markets already to stabilize currencies. So this is, of course, something to keep an eye on, this financial contagion. But so far, the policy response has been pretty active and strong, I would say, on the monetary side. And the impact on currencies has not been so far too dramatic in the region. On the fiscal side of that, we do see some more difficulties. So of course, there is going to need to be a fiscal response to this. First and foremost, to handle refugee inflows and to support the refugees that are arriving in the region, but also to support the poorer households with these rapidly rising energy and food prices. Now, there is still some policy space to do this, not maybe as much as there was a couple of years ago. We have seen, largely because of COVID and the response there, public debt loads have risen in the region. That's the chart on the left, quite considerably in a lot of countries. But the level of public debt, I mean, if you compare this to pretty much anywhere in Western Europe, it is still very low in Central and Eastern Europe. Very few countries even have hit 60% of GDP, so the Maastricht criteria level. So maybe not the space that there was in 2019, but still this implies some fiscal space. And then on the right, we see, and this is also part of the financial contagion, but it's also because of the policy response and higher policy rates, we do see government debt interest rates rising. So yields on sovereign debt are rising. I show here as an example, Poland, Czechia, Romania, and Hungary. So this also implies, I think, a closing of some of the fiscal space. But if you do this in real terms, and if you think about the inflation rates in the region, we still see pretty much everywhere negative real rates, even at the 10-year maturity. So this again implies, I think, that there is some policy space, not maybe what there was in the past, but still some space for governments to act to mitigate the impact of this in the region. On the trade side, the headline numbers suggest actually a fairly limited exposure in most countries. So these charts show exports left, imports right, from or to Russia and Ukraine as a share of the total. You see there are some countries which have quite a lot of exposure. Belarus is the most obvious, but also some of the Baltic states, for example. But overall, the region's trade integration with Russia and Ukraine is not that high as a share of the total, and it is reduced, especially in the EU member states of the region, quite considerably since 2013. So since the annexation of Crimea, the exchange of sanctions then, we've seen a partial decoupling in an economic sense from Russia, which reduces the exposure now. One of my colleagues modeled this a bit, so estimating with a 10% decline in Russian demand, what would it mean for the GDP of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe? What would be the impact purely via the trade channel? And we assume, so we have the baseline scenario, which is the gray, and then a scenario whereby there's a diversion and trade is diverted to other countries. That's the orange. And you can see that in pretty much every case, the impact on headline GDP is very limited. So the trade impact, so the impact of the decline in Russian demand is not especially significant for pretty much all of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. There's a huge caveat to that, of course, and that is that this is all if the gas keeps flowing, and that is a very big question that a lot of people are discussing now. The data on this chart, I'm sure everybody here is already very familiar with this. It's a huge media coverage, these kind of indicators. So who is most dependent on Russian gas as a share in their energy mix? Here I've highlighted in orange the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. You can see the exposure is massive. The reliance on Russia is massive. In some cases, 100% of the needs are met by Russia. So this is, of course, a major area of vulnerability for the region. We've thought about this a bit within our institute. What would it mean if we stop importing Russian gas and oil, if the EU does a complete import ban? On the household side, of course, the winter is passing, then the household need for gas is falling all the time as we head towards warmer weather. And as I already said, there is fiscal space to cushion the blow for the poorest households in the event that we do this, which of course would mean much higher prices. There's clear vulnerability for parts of industry, including in Central and Eastern Europe. And I mean, Milan can certainly say more about this than me, but I would guess that that's a big part of why this hasn't happened, is because of the concerns about what it would mean for industry. Our best guess is that an import stop now would take about 3 percentage points from euro area growth this year. It would mean a recession, not a dramatic recession, not like 2020, not like 2009, but a recession, and feasibly in parts of Central and Eastern Europe where there's more exposure, a bit more than that. So we don't think we should downplay the economic consequences. There would be negative economic consequences of this, but our sense is that fiscally, this is manageable. And I mean, my opinion, which is not very important, is that we should have done this already. I mean, that we can manage this, but those are the rough numbers that we would put on it at this stage. In terms of labor markets, my colleague Marina wrote a very nice section of the report. I encourage you to read it. I cannot do full justice to it here. The basic assessment is that, of course, at the moment we're talking about the refugee crisis. The priority is mental health support to refugees. It will be a challenging first year, especially in countries like Poland, where a large majority of the refugees are arriving. The Commission Temporary Protection Scheme is a positive first step in already thinking about the integration of refugees into labor markets. There are 3 main challenges to that. We think the first is, of course, that mostly we're talking about women, children, elderly people. It's not easy for them to enter the labor market immediately. The women who are coming have young children with them. Of course, that's a serious consideration in the first instance. Second challenge is that a lot of EU labor markets are still recovering from COVID. And then the third thing is that although actually we find that Ukrainian refugees are on average well-educated, they are better educated than the EU average, actually. There are always challenges with, and we know this from the past, with the transferability of skills, of knowledge, work experience, at least in the short run. Our assessment, and especially my colleague Marina's assessment, all of this is manageable, but it will of course take some time. It will take well-designed policies. But from next year, we should be talking about a positive labor supply shock in Central and Eastern Europe, especially in countries like Poland. And we know that a lot of the region has been suffering from labor shortages. So there should be some positive effect on the region's labor markets here, even if, of course, the circumstances are very sad and we wish it wasn't the case. That is what we would expect to see. I will finish then with some first thoughts on the medium term. Of course, it's very speculative at the moment, but these are some of the things we've been working through also at the Institute. I think the main message here is that we're talking about a major acceleration of a process that has been happening already in economic and financial terms, which is a decoupling of Russia from the West, or Russia from the majority of the rest of Europe, which started in 2013. And whichever indicators you look at, macro, trade, financial indicators, you see a very clear change in trend from 2013, a reduction in integration between Russia and the West. February 2022 was probably the swan song for really broad European economic and financial integration, and will be lower in the future than it has been in the past. For Ukraine, of course, major uncertainty. We're looking, unfortunately, probably at a divided future for the country. Once the conflict stops, of course, we don't know when that will be. There will be a major rebuilding job in the unoccupied part of Ukraine. We would expect major Western financial support for that. In the Russian-occupied part, if there is a Russian-occupied part, of course, the economic situation will be very difficult. There will be stagnation. There will be further outward migration. This part will be isolated from large parts of the global economy. For Russia, the medium-term growth outlook, long-term growth outlook was already not very good. It was already one of the most meager growth stories in the whole region. Now, of course, it's much worse. The Russians themselves place a lot of hopes in the relationship with China. Of course, China can replace some of what will be lost, but a large part of Western technological transfer, which is what Russia really needs to achieve a higher state of economic development, China cannot replace that, certainly not anytime soon. For the non-EU member states of Central and Eastern Europe, many of which have pursued a kind of balancing act, also in an economic sense, between Russia and the West, this balancing act, of course, becomes much more difficult. Again, very interested to hear what Milan has to say about a country like Serbia, for example. But when we look in the economic and financial sense, these countries, so countries in the Western Balkans, for example, also Turkey, the economic ties, the financial ties are overwhelmingly stronger with the EU and other parts of Central and Eastern Europe than they are with Russia or China. And so the economic financial logic of these countries, as we see it, is very much Western oriented. For the EU member states of Central and Eastern Europe, a lot of implications, of course, beyond the initial challenges that I've already mentioned. We would expect the green transition to speed up in the medium term. Of course, there are very different views on that in parts of Central and Eastern Europe. Of course, more defense spending. And then I think the story that's maybe very important, but very difficult to say anything concrete about at the moment, is how this affects long-term investment decisions. We would expect investors to become probably more cautious in light of what's happening, and a great deal of this will probably depend on how the long-term US security commitment to Europe looks like. Of course, it's not in question at the moment, but many things can change in the future. So final slide, just briefly, the policy priorities to sum up. For Ukraine, of course, immediate priority for Western, for OECD countries, address the humanitarian crisis. Once the war ends, reconstruction, focus on reconstruction will require massive Western financial aid. And beyond that, I think there's a clear case, we think there's a clear case for much stronger EU economic integration with the unoccupied part of Ukraine. In the rest of Europe, of course, immediate term measures to support refugees, measures to support households, poorer households through this huge increase in commodity prices. Beyond that, acceleration of the green transition, that is a fundamental part of the story of getting away from reliance on Russian energy. And then the final thing, what we in our institute always like to say, and I take the opportunity to say it again, is what we would like to see out of this is an acceleration of Western Balkan EU integration. This must be a wake-up call in that sense. The full report is on the website. I think you get the slides afterwards, so you can click it. We had a big project team, so I'm presenting on behalf of a lot of people here. And thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Richard, for this very insightful economic assessment, economic and social assessment of the impacts of the war. And perhaps I would, because of course at the OECD we have our own assessments. We did discuss the paper on our first paper and assessment on the impacts of the Ukraine war some time ago, but more with a focus on Germany. So Nicola, perhaps you can just give us a gist of what this paper. So it's not a focus on CE countries, but it did clearly show that the impact on CE countries, and that would include the German-speaking countries, there is particularly strong. So how would you react to WiiW's assessment? Is it in line with what we think, and what are the main messages of the OECD assessment? You're muted,
yeah.
Nicola.
Just for a small precision, I'm heading the desk of Poland and also Estonia, who was in the presentation. So I will probably focus more on the mechanism of those two countries. But generally, the assessment that had just been presented is in line for a lot of macro aspects on trade, inflation, trade dependency. Financial stability, as rightly said, is not is not really a risk. Moreover, a lot of countries they have well capitalized bank. All the requirements on banks that have been put during COVID have been lifted for some countries quite recently. So this restore this will manage further risk on stability. In terms of quantification, also that's broadly in line, but for some country we are seeing, so you presented an average impact, but for some country will be more severely impacted and it will cost more than 2 points of growth. I'm thinking about Estonia, for example, who was supposed to, after having registered 8.5% last year, they were supposed to be around 3%. And I was reading this morning, the central bank is forecasting a recession only due to this. So that's quite a gap. And that's through the same mechanism. That's we highlight so at the OECD, that inflation and the decoupling between the growth of wage and inflation will cause purchasing power. And so this is also okay. There is some things that probably was not in the OECD report, but that came up. In fact, last week I was in Poland for the structural mission for the preparation of the next survey. Is when we are talking about the shock on the labor market, of course we are talking about the migrants who arrived, but we are not talking much about those who left. And it's a real issue, for example, in a country like Poland, because the numbers were a bit, were varying quite a lot. But we hear this number about 30,000 Ukrainian males who left the construction sector in Poland. This is really dramatic. Let's face it, Poland has already a super tight labor market, and Poland has the housing problems that have been identified since a long time, and so the problem is that the migrants who arrive cannot replace those the men typically who left, and I think it's due to legal reasons, because they were obliged. I don't know if they were obliged to come back, but the men in Ukraine between 18 and 60 were obliged to stay. And so, to be honest, the Polish authorities were a bit worried about this on a lot of aspects, on the need for housing that is even more important with the current wave, but also that's the fact when you are saying in the presentation that could accelerate who will be the workers that will work on it. So that's really that's something the flow in the other direction is really important. There is also one aspect that both Poland and Estonia are telling me is the issue of the language. When we talk about labor market integration, those two countries, short-term policy response is put in place some effective language course, because that offers the paradox for this country of having a very tight labor market. Estonia had a very tight labor market, Poland had a super tight labor market. And so there could be a rise in unemployment, but with no really activation and allocation on the labor market. So this one, for example, for Estonia, they are forecasting a 10% unemployment rate, so almost a rise of 4.5%, but with no downward pressure on inflation and to wage, for example. So this is a situation that is peculiar. Because in Estonia, to work, in the general sense, you need to know Estonian. Otherwise, you can't. That has been, a recurrent issue on the integration due to the Estonian language. Otherwise, you can go work for the Russian communities. That is 1/4 of the Estonian population, but I'm not sure Ukrainian we like this very much. And in Poland, that's the same. And so both countries were telling me that this is a major obstacle to integration. I'm thinking about women in services, for example. So that could be the kind of short-term reply that could be put in place straight, because when we are saying we will see the impact next year, but the policy action should start now, and particularly on this aspect. Because, for example, Poland, they were not that worried on the integration, but to the condition of language.
Okay.
And
thanks, Nicola.
I just wanted just one point. We have the same assessment on fiscal space that government can support low-income households, but we should notice also that in those countries there always been a problem of high labor tax wage for low-skilled workers, So this could be also the opportunity to operate some structural reforms that will increase take-home pay, and that could be a way to alleviate the pain for those households while doing reforms that are going in the right direction. Thanks.
Thank you, Nicola. Maybe because you've talked about Poland, and then also, of course, Poland is really at the forefront of and other CE countries receiving refugees, and we had a strong message also in our paper, the OECD, that cooperation is needed here, how, because there are fiscal and other implications. So perhaps, Piotr, you can tell us how the situation looks from Poland, perhaps in particular with respect to refugees and other repercussions that Nicola just mentioned, that the integration of labor markets in the region has, because of course this is disrupted, just as trade is disrupted in some ways. So it would be good to get your take here.
Okay, so thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the chance to speak. I just wanted to clarify one thing, because we just heard that discussion about immigration and refugees. Please remember, those people are refugees. Women and children and old men and women coming to Poland are not seeking employment. They do they are employed. They're they consume. They have for a short period of time a positive impact on the economy, but still this is not economic migration. And although it's very much different than in Middle Eastern countries where similar conflicts break out, we with this pattern of migration that was present in Poland and in Western Europe before, those people quite easily blend into the labor market. They also have specific saying basically that they're for the next 18 months they're on the same level as a Polish citizen in terms of the employability of a person coming from Ukraine, depending of course on the education status of this person, knowledge of the language and things which are quite normal when you're looking at an employee. But still, the similarity between the Ukrainian language and Polish makes it quite easy for those people to learn to speak. Not, unfortunately, not maybe to read and write, because we have the Latin alphabet, not the Cyrillic. The experts on migration say that 30 to 40% of those people left Poland at this moment. So it's not that we have present at this moment 2 million Ukrainian refugees. Could be a similar number, could be a little lower, it could be lower. Also, from the other parts of Central and Eastern Europe, the migration flow is towards Western Europe and Poland. So even if there are people who went through the Slovak and Romanian border, they might be in our country. So basically, it's very difficult at this moment to say how many people are actually present in each one of those countries in the European Union. In a couple of months, we're going to see probably more specific data, because there are the Ukrainian refugees entering Poland get the so-called Polish IRS number in order to basically use all the public services, healthcare, be employed, and stuff like that. So people were queuing up. This is what you probably saw on CNN or Fox News when you saw President Biden visiting the registration center in Warsaw. So those people basically go through the registration process in order to get this IRS number in Poland. And thanks to that, they're employable. Actually, as an institution, we're also employing a refugee economist coming from Kiev in a couple of months, and we were waiting for her to have this number so that she can work with us on some specific issues. Probably, and then there was the issue of some of the men leaving Poland from the construction and industry side. So approximately by the estimates of the Ukrainian authorities, it's approximately 200,000 people. Still, have in mind that we don't know if they are all of them are coming from Poland, and based on the temporary migration flow of the Ukrainian migration before. So those were people who went to Poland for 6 months, went back to Ukraine, typically pre-war, and then came back after a period of time. So it's very difficult to say that, for example, this is influencing very much the construction or construction business in Poland. Of course, it has. So we hear the voices. We don't see it in the data yet. So I cannot say that we have fewer employees in Poland. Probably we have more because of the additional inflow of the refugees, which some of them, with the large scale of that, actually try to find jobs. And we actually we do surveys on the Polish business sector each month in order to know what is coming with the business cycle, the perspective of business operations in Poland. We also have a composite index of conjuncture of the business cycle, and what we see is that a third of Polish enterprises says, a third of managers, so 33% say that they're going to employ a refugee coming from Ukraine. So what they plan in the next couple of months. Of course, these are also declarations, but the problem with employability, so planning of employing new employees, actually is on the very same level as it was before. So 20% of companies actually have plans of employing people, which is like nothing is happening. And after the first shock at the beginning of March, when we saw that the indicators of optimism or pessimism of the businesses going negative ground, so more pessimist than optimist. Currently, what we see in our data is that they're coming back on track, and the war is not such a severe shock as the pandemic for the business, which some of the businesses see. There's this problem with the labor supply, which was present through the last 5 or 4 years. Currently we're at the peak level of employment, and also one of the lowest levels in terms of the unemployment in Poland. But with this external shock, actually people are scared for their jobs. This is one of the things that you're going to see in what the employees say. So they're scared that with the war, basically, that companies start to fire people in order to cut down costs. And this also might have an influence on the inflation expectations and wages for some employees. So this also has an impact on the inflation rate. So war equals inflation, as we know from theory. Basically, each time you have a shock like that, it increases the prices. But it also has an impact on the employees in Poland, not demanding, or some of them basically not demanding a higher wage that easy. And also in some sectors, basically service sectors, where the employees, the refugees from Ukraine could, and part of them, on high wages, is going to be lower than it probably would be at the same situation. But of course, for Poland, one of the biggest issues is the energy prices and inflation issue. Central and Eastern Europe, with the wages going up, and Richard talked about this in his presentation, the external shocks of the gas market and the supply side increased the inflation, which is to be higher in the catching up economies. And currently, it's very much what the central banks of those countries which are not in the Eurozone are trying to cool down the economy. Yesterday, we had a decision of the Polish Central Bank of increasing the interest rate by 1 percentage point. So currently, it's at 4.5. The inflation rate for March was 10.9. And please have in mind that the government introduced some tax breaks, decreasing the level of VAT taxation on the consumer goods and energy prices. So actually, the inflation rate would probably be higher, around 12 or 13%, 13 or 14% at this moment. And we are going to expect such a high inflation rate in the next couple of months. The average inflation rate, according to our new estimates, based on the new data, is 10.8 on average for 2022. So that's high. That's high. Sure. For the society. That's high. Yeah, and this is one of the biggest issue. I just want to talk about very briefly, so 30 seconds, on education. all the experts on migration which I talked with say that due to the crisis, we don't have yet surveys of the Ukrainians, so we don't know what those people think, or we can just, based on some of the discussions that we see or the chatter on the Facebook groups in Ukrainian, we know that those people think that this crisis could be temporary. So all of this migration is seen as a temporary solution for most of them. This is also why the education system yet is on a temporary basis. So it's not, nobody is thinking about integration. The kids Ukrainian kids going to Polish schools, the families who send them there, and the authorities are not asking this question. At the moment when we see that this is could become permanent, then with the changing decision of the Ukrainians, new solutions are going to be put into place. But yet it's not the moment. Most of the Ukrainians you're going to talk want to come back to Ukraine. So they think about the economic package which the European Commission and the developed world is going to provide Ukraine, Poland too, for the development, redevelopment, and reconstruction of the country. So they're looking for EBOR and the European Investment Bank's projects. They think about that, and those people are also wanting to come back. They left their cars, sometimes even their animals in Ukraine. They're thinking about coming back, and this is also why the level of migration of the refugees coming through the eastern borders stopped a bit, because most of the migration is of the migrants and refugees is within the Ukraine. It's not outside of Ukraine. Most of those people who escaped the war zone went to western part of the country where there are no fights happening, and they still wait to come back to their hometowns. Thank you.
Thanks, Piotr. And before I go to the others, but just very briefly, because I want to start taking up the questions from the chat, and there are many. And in that respect, what you just said, there was one question, well, what about, so Richard said, well, we need to support Ukraine once the war stops. And somebody in the chat basically asked, what about well, the situation that you just described, that most refugees who are now in Poland are really thinking about not integrating, but going back as soon as it's possible.
Well, this is a difficult issue. So all the literature from previous crises and wars says us that private investors wait approximately on average 5 years to come back to a country that was under war. So this is probably, we have to wait for a couple of years for the private investors to come back to Ukraine. This is a chance for development funds and ODA basically being used for Ukraine. But if, this is a question, and I'm no expert here, so if the war is going to last longer, if it's not going to end in a month, probably we're going to, and it's going to take longer, probably we're going to have to, parts of Ukraine are safe, so nation building, and even if you have a war zone, you have, but it also means that some of the projects will have to be conducted with United Nations support and help, and also security. If the conflict is not ended. So this is also another risk which some of the countries and some of the agencies will have to take into account. Are we willing to do, from the Polish perspective, of course we're willing to do that. It's our neighbor. We have a difficult history and past, but it's something that you need to do. Lots of Polish people have Ukrainian descent, even me. So my grandmother is from Harkov. So this is something you just gonna do. Yeah.
Thanks, Piotr. And I want to move to Hungary now, and I can see we would have needed much more time, but Barbara, you're looking more at the business side of it, obviously, and you're looking at the at this conflict and its repercussions from an investment and trade, a business perspective, and perhaps you can just tell us what the situation looks like from Hungary at this moment, and also in terms of course, the very tight economic relations between Germany and Hungary, but also other neighbors. So the supply chains there.
Yes, thank you very much, Nicola. And well, a lot of what Piotr said could also apply to Hungary, but to some extent, the situation is also a little bit different. Starting with the refugee situation, Hungary has accepted around 650,000 people in comparison to a population of roughly 10 million. And what we hear is that a lot of people continue to Western Europe, so only a fraction of this is staying in Hungary, although no reliable data is really available. For the companies, they had always Ukrainian workers in their productions. So for this reason, there is a high likelihood that they could also integrate Ukrainians in the labor market. But of course, as we said, a lot of women and children are coming. So I don't think that this could work one-to-one. But Hungary does not only have a large manufacturing basis, but also a lot of service centers, global service centers. So this would be a way to absorb part of the people if they wish to. Overall, Hungary is operating very much on the business model of a contract manufacturer to a large extent for Germany and other countries. So one of the questions that we have is, how does the situation in Germany reflect back to Hungary? The trade relations between Hungary and Ukraine and Russia are not so significantly, but if you look at Germany, then the impact is much bigger, and then it might come to situations where German companies have to review their overall strategy, what is the demand, what is really needed, and can they continue their Hungarian operations to the extent as planned. So these are this is one set of the questions. And the other thing, as a contract manufacturer, Hungary is very sensitive to price increases. This includes energy, but not only. And this is the other big part that we are looking at. Hungary is also experiencing a high inflation rate, depending on the sector, between 8 and 10% roughly. And energy prices is part of this, but not fully, because at this point in time, Hungary can rely on gas supply from Russia. They just made long-term contracts or extended long-term contracts right before the war. So this impact is not seen to that extent, but of course the question is, what happens to coal, what happens to oil? All of this could reflect back. The EU has also started its rule of law mechanism, so there are a lot of external factors which also reflect back in Hungary, which is not fully related to Ukraine, but also to other factors. Overall, we think that the next year will be more difficult this year already, and also next year will be more difficult for Hungary, and a lot depends on how things are playing out in Ukraine and Russia, but also towards Germany and the EU.
Thank you, Barbara, for this view from Hungary. And Milan, you will get these issues at the war, the conflict and its repercussions also from a political perspective. And we are already in full swing in the thorny political discussion about gas embargo, not gas embargo, but we also heard that there's a massive refugee inflow, as Piotr said, or what I hear a lot from CE countries is, so Barbara said some of them are moving on, but also there's a lot of solidarity at the moment, or willingness to receive these refugees. Repercussions on also food prices, which are an issue in the countries themselves, CE countries themselves, but of course also has repercussions in Africa and other places. So my question to you is, how important is it now to act politically, for example, find the right support for lower income households, so that socially this can be cushioned, politically also this situation, to cooperate in Europe on receiving refugees? And what are the political risks of all these tensions and possibly recessions, or at least strongly slowing growth? How do you see that from a political perspective?
Thank you for having me. Excellent presentation by Richard Grieveson, and very good discussion. Looking at time, I will take a mental note to ask my colleagues if you're interested to have a second part of it next month, hosted by the GAP. I think it would be great. Now, the Central Eastern Europe is a less homogeneous region, and this crisis will prove it again. Then we meet the eye and we think. You not only have the EU members and then the non-EU, the Western Balkans and the Eastern Partnership and so on, but you have also emerging differences within countries that were in the same region. For instance, within the Visegrad group, Barbara mentioned the different approach of Hungary, not only on Russia and energy, but also on price caps, price control and so on. You also have Poland and Hungary without approved recovery and resilience plan from the EU, which is a huge, inflow of EU money at the blocked, so far blocked, frozen plan for Hungary, for instance, at the, I think at the tune of 7 billion. 7 billion euros in grants. It's 5% of GDP. So Slovakia, for instance, already has received the first tranche and is using some of this money to fund reforms and public investment, which is in this crisis very, very important. You asked me to look at some silver lining, like where this might be. Before I come to it, 2 minutes left. Let me say that I see big difference in security. You have NATO and non-NATO part of this region. I don't know to what extent investors will start to differentiate in the Western Balkans between, let's say, Northern Macedonia and Serbia. But I see, as Richard suggested, really Serbia and President Vučić just re-elected in a very difficult position, trying this balancing act to do a little bit of Russia, promising sanctions later to the EU. I'm not optimistic on accelerating EU accession, but I really hope that North Macedonia and Albania will get the start of the EU accession talks later this year. Now, the silver lining, we might see acceleration of energy transition. Green Deal was seen as a big divide between Central Eastern Europe in the EU and Germany, for instance, or Western Europe. Now it's more acceptable to move away from fossil fuels and even sort of decreasing energy depends on Russia. So decarbonization is somehow politically sexy now, and also good for your security. Labor market, I see already competition among governments and countries to attract IT specialists from Ukraine or Belarus or Russia. I think that will come later on. You have, for instance, Hungary is not so attractive for Ukraine refugees for political reasons, but might be for Russians. Poland, vice versa, and so on. There is the labor market. We need to study more this impact, what it means. They are already health sector, transport sector are something where Central Eastern Europe had acute labor shortages, and they were relying on Ukrainians. I know Prague as a city, for instance, and into election next year, very much divided and polarized, fragile governments, tiny sort of majority in the parliament, and unable to pass some compromises with the European Commission for the recovery fund. Slovakia, my country, 2034, a big election year. All this will be a fuel for populists and radicals. So my big worry is radicalization and more political instability.
And an opportunity can also lead to more cooperation in the region if things go well. Countries support each other, and with the EU supports with receiving the refugees, etc. So
that is a very positive story. There will be backlash, but for many countries, to simple, there is now no other safe haven or safe port than the EU and NATO.
Yeah. And maybe to look at, I mean, silver line is really difficult to say in this situation, but because Milan also, as I just said it, Richard, to come back to your longer term structural view, when you said the question is, what will all of this do?
It's also speculative, but my best guess would be yes. I mean, I think at the moment what you see is whatever it takes, whether it's coal, nuclear, whatever it takes to reduce the reliance on Russian energy. But I think the medium term, it really reinforces the logic of the Green Deal. And I think that in this case, there's a very important role for Poland probably in all of this, because it goes beyond Green Deal, it goes beyond energy. Of course, we have seen conflict between Poland and Germany, Poland and the EU on different questions, on this rule of law thing, on Green Deal, on different things. Poland by its size is a major player. I mean, it is a majorly important country, of course, within Central and Eastern Europe, within the EU as a whole. Poland has a very particular view towards Russia, always has, not new to this crisis. And I think it's very interesting to see now how the dynamics within the EU.
But this view is based on experience.
No, I'm not at all critiquing that view. What I'm saying is that I can see how these divisions within the EU, and here we're talking specifically about, on the Green Deal and the necessity and speed and financing the Green Deal, how there's much more room for compromise now. That would be my assessment. Now, that might not apply to Hungary. Hungary may well end up more isolated as a result of this, but my sense would be with Poland and the discussion between Poland and Germany or between Poland and France, things now look different. And so my best guess, and as a speculative, my best guess is will accelerate the green transition in the EU.
Interesting. And we're really at the end of our time. And as Milan said, it was not, we don't have enough time to discuss all of this. But the idea was really to open the well, the set of issues that are coming, that are raised by this crisis, and to turn this into a series. I'm really very happy to meet at DGAP Milan, but maybe we can take just a little bit more time to go into a few questions that came up in the chat, and here perhaps again for you, Richard, or also you, Milan. So this, of course, you always say that the Western Balkans have to be better integrated, or and is this perhaps another opportunity that countries will see it's important to be present, to help? Not even talking EU accession, but perhaps just engagement, support. Do you see this as a little silver lining, perhaps, as an opportunity to cooperate better?
Well, I mean, I would leave the pure politics of this to Milan, because I don't, I don't think my opinion is worth that much on that. I mean, I think it should, I mean, it should be a wake-up call in EU capitals about EU accession. I mean, we're now almost 2 decades on from Thessaloniki, when the EU accession perspective of the Western Balkans was confirmed. Since then, only Croatia's joined. I mean, almost nothing has happened. And I would say, just to look at it from, and I know this is not the whole story, but from the perspective of an economics research institute, I mean, this is a region which is geographically completely surrounded by the EU. It's not so it's on the edge, it is already geographically within the borders of the EU. The economic and financial integration with the EU is overwhelmingly strong. It is extremely strong. You're talking about 2/3 of trade, 2/3 of investment, at least. In some countries, it's more than that. We have stabilization association agreements for years now. This integration has gone much further. There are concerns, about the fiscal aspects of this, but these countries together, all 6 of them, including Serbia, is the GDP of Slovakia. It's a bit more than 1% of EU GDP. It's not, in economic terms, it's not very much for the EU to absorb. And my sense, but as I say, it's not my area, is that the politics of this is even clearer than it was before. It is absolutely in the EU's interest to fully integrate these. I mean, we have this new approach now, which I think comes initially from the French side, of this staged accession, including in economic terms, so to go step by step. If that's how it have to be, fine. But I think we need more impetus, because it has stalled for quite a long time. And my sense would be that it's politically a very negative thing. And it should get a boost from what we're seeing now. And it's in an economic sense, absolutely in the EU's interest. It's absolutely in the Western Balkan interest. And it's absolutely manageable economically to absorb the Western Balkans. At least, if it has to be staged, is fine, but at least much more than is currently the case into the EU.
Perhaps rather than giving you the word on only that one round, I would like to make is about this politically thorny issue of a gas embargo, how fast to become independent of Russian energy imports. And Barbara already said that in Hungary, that's not necessarily on the agenda. Perhaps for other countries, Milan, I don't know whether you will know more, or Piotr, for you, perhaps also in Poland, how is that issue? How is that viewed, and how dependent is Poland on energy imports? How important is that for the inflation and all these issues that you put forward? So Piotr first, and then Milan, perhaps on other countries.
Okay, so from the Polish perspective, you won't. There are a few, but the majority, and I'm talking like 90% of the economists you're going to talk to, it's not a question about the inflation rate. There's I think it was Summers that said it, that nobody is going to talk about, in 50 years, nobody is going to ask us about the inflation rate in 2022, given genocide happening in Ukraine. So this is not an economic question. So from the Polish perspective, a ban on imports of gas, oil is a must, and coal. The governmental plan and the Polish plan Even before the war, it was to end gas imports from Russia with the end of this year. So this is going just to happen. With oil, this is a bigger difficulty because of technological reasons. In order to use a different kind of the Brandt oil than the Ural oil by the Polish refinery petrochemical plants. But still the technology is there, so they just didn't do it on a larger scale. But so the decision is, if there's a whole wide EU decision on sanction these two energy sources, these two oil and gas and also coal, then these three energy sources, then yeah, we're going to do that. And it's not a question anybody's asking how it's going to have an impact on the inflation rate. We're going to pay more. Some of the European countries, and we did a paper on that, are going to have difficulties especially with oil transportation, because we don't have sufficient connectivity. And with gas, it's not going to be easy just to be conducted in a month or two. It means a lot of decision, but we need a roadmap saying, okay, up until this point, we won't have any gas from Russia anymore. Yeah, this is very much a consensus in Poland, if you ask anybody, and it's not an economic discussion. We're gonna pay the price. That's the end of the debate. The Ukrainians are paying the price with their lives.
Interesting. And Milan, how do you see other countries like Slovakia? Because somebody said greetings from Slovakia, 100% dependent on gas. Is it a question of time more, immediate, now, later? You said the energy transition has become popular through this situation.
Look, it's a question of interconnectedness, whether you have alternatives. Slovakia will have another gas connector with Poland ready in June. So as long as there will be enough LNG coming to the pipes in Europe, then Slovakia could be, could have a solution long term. I think you will see differences among governments who was prepared, not prepared, who is now doing enough contingency or not, and also what are the energy mixes. It's a very complex issue. It will hurt. There is a political acceptance that you need to deleverage from Russian gas and oil, but at least oil is easier. What is not discussed enough is a dependency on nuclear on Tver and Russian nuclear fuel. That's a strategic commodity. So very quietly, in my home country, there was a plane. After the war started, they realized that they don't have nuclear fuel for more than a year. So Russia delivered, and this was underestimated. So you will have this long-term strategic issues that were neglected depending on the country. And I think you can solve them only with at the EU and NATO level. Last thing, if I may, very quickly on Richard's point on EU enlargement and the Balkans. Unfortunately, I don't see the Balkan governments prepared. The frontrunners, Serbia and Montenegro, who are negotiating in the accession talks, Montenegro has a huge domestic crisis and instability. Serbia is semi-authoritarian, state that wants to continue, that wants to play with on all sides. I rather see a positive sort of impulse from this, not only for Ukraine but also for Moldova, and there some kind of a deep DCFTA and accession plus integration to markets, and there is a political will for that. Commission will have to respond to their membership application by the summer.
Thanks. And I will ask some last questions to Nicola and Barbara, and then I think we will have to stop, but we will have to get together again. Nicola, there was one question: can the Baltics avoid a recession because of its dependence on the Russian economy? Perhaps you want to say, well, we don't have projections out, but these scenarios. But perhaps more importantly, to come back to so Piotr said nobody will ask about the inflation in the future. That's right. But of course, there's a big shock, as Richard showed, to energy and food prices, and our own assessment showed that we know, right, that lower income households are particularly hard hit. So is it important now to do you do that at the economics department in the OECD to think about how to design fiscal support to the households that are hardest hit, so to be able to cushion this shock? Is this important?
Thanks. I mean, the mechanism to support households are pretty simple. When we are talking about the Baltics, I don't really know for other countries, but I mean, clearly, when you look at a chart of level of debt, you always look at the left for Estonia, because this is absolutely low level. So there is room for support, and I said the mechanism for support are really straightforward. But as I was saying after the presentation, typically Estonia, I mean, decrease the labor tax wage for low-income household in the recent year, but still there is room for decreasing more, and this could really improve take-home pay for low-skilled, and so generally low-income households. So that could be one of the reply, but I think overall, I mean, Estonia has inflation since, let's say, October. It's really high. There's a specificity of Estonia. They have super flexible electricity contracts. So when the price increases, it's directly translated in price. And so the government put in place some support, some cap of on energy that is really the good way to go. So in terms of policy replies, there is nothing to think in terms of new design, but or you can sustain it in the long run, because everybody is saying that the real shock will be also next winter. So in terms, I can speak only for Estonia. In terms of fiscal space, it's completely it's
possible. It's a matter of designing it well. And Barbara, you will have the final word, because we talked about and Milan talked about the political risk in all of this, and certainly Hungary, as you said, is taking a different stance there. So in terms of also economic relations in the region, when you look at the business you're dealing with, how important is that? Is that seen as a danger for investment for being present in Hungary, or is it not so much an issue, and basically the economic relations continue in spite of no matter what the political tensions may be?
Well, when I look at the region, in the past, when we talked about V4 and assumed they would have a rather similar approach, I think this is a way to inflate a little bit the importance of Hungary in this regard. But I think from an economic standpoint, I cannot see that it has an immediate impact if the countries go a different route. We have to say that Hungary has an extremely stable economic policy, and that it is very supportive both for investment, but also relief of the lower income households, of course, for political reasons. But the effect is that there is a lot of stability in Hungary. And if Ukraine and Russia does not spill over into NATO territory, I don't see any instability arising here in Hungary. So I think we have to differentiate the effects that we've talked about today.
I'm muted. Yes, so it took us, we took almost 20 minutes longer than we were expecting to. I think we do need to get together again. So many thorny issues, common challenges, social, economic challenges, and of course the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. So we have many things to discuss still, and perhaps we can go in the future by issue. So refugees, trade, and also something we didn't discuss too much is really but it's a big issue given the importance of Ukraine and Russia for food security. It's also something to be discussed. I'm glad we all came together, and thank you for you, Richard, for a great presentation, but also Milan, Barbara, Piotr, and Nicola for your contributions and different insights. And yeah, I'm looking forward to meeting you again soon, and have a nice afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Nicola.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.